Louis Armstrong was in the middle of "What a Wonderful World" when he saw the terror in the young boy's eyes. Not the kind of stage fright that comes with performing, but the raw, animal fear that comes from being hunted. The boy was maybe 16, clutching a trumpet case like it was his only lifeline, standing at the edge of the crowd in the colored section of the outdoor venue in Clarksdale, Mississippi. And in that split second, Louis Armstrong knew that this kid wasn't just another fan hoping for an autograph. He was running for his life. What happened in the next 48 hours would become one of the most dangerous and heroic acts of Louis Armstrong's career. But it's a story that was buried for 70 years, hidden in police reports, whispered conversations, and the conscience of a man who understood that sometimes music isn't enough to save a life. Sometimes you have to risk everything you've built to do what's right. It was August 15, 1952. The humid Mississippi air hung thick like molasses over the makeshift stage that had been erected in a cotton field outside Clarksdale. This was the Deep South at its most unforgiving. Jim Crow laws weren't just suggestions here, they were enforced with nightsticks, dogs, and worse. A black man could be lynched for looking at a white woman the wrong way, let alone for the crime that 16-year-old Marcus Johnson was accused of. But Louis Armstrong didn't know about Marcus Johnson yet. All Louis knew was that he had a show to perform, and despite the oppressive heat, despite the tension that seemed to crackle in the air like electricity before a storm, he was going to give these people something beautiful. That's what Louis Armstrong did. He took ugliness and transformed it into joy, even when joy seemed impossible. The venue was segregated, of course. White folks sat in chairs on one side of the field, black folks stood in a designated area on the other side, separated by a rope that might as well have been the Grand Canyon. But music has a way of crossing lines that society draws, and when Louis Armstrong lifted that trumpet to his lips, when that first golden note pierced the Mississippi night, the artificial barriers seemed to dissolve. For a moment, everyone was just human, connected by something larger than hatred. Louis was halfway through his second set when he noticed the commotion. There was movement at the edge of the colored section, men pushing through the crowd, their voices raised in anger. And there, trying to disappear into the mass of bodies, was the boy with the trumpet case. Marcus Johnson had been on the run for 3 days. His crime? Playing trumpet in a Meridian church where a white family was visiting? The daughter of a prominent local politician had complimented Marcus's playing, had even asked him about learning trumpet herself. In 1952 Mississippi, that innocent conversation might as well have been a death sentence. The girl's father, Sheriff Clayton Thorne, had twisted the interaction into something sinister. Word spread that Marcus had made advances on the white girl, had overstepped his place. By the time Marcus understood the danger he was in, a mob was already forming. His family had hidden him for 2 days, then begged him to run. "Get to Memphis," his grandmother had whispered, pressing her life savings into his hands. "Find Louis Armstrong's people. They'll help you." It was a desperate plan based on hope and rumor. Everyone knew Louis Armstrong spoke out against segregation, that he'd refused to play certain venues, that he'd once called President Eisenhower two-faced for not protecting black children integrating schools. But hoping Louis Armstrong would risk his career to save one unknown teenager was like hoping lightning would strike twice in the same place. Louis saw the men closing in on the boy. He recognized the type immediately, the kind of men who wore their hatred like a badge, who found purpose in cruelty. Sheriff Thorne was leading them, his hand resting on his pistol, his eyes scanning the crowd like a hunter tracking prey. Without missing a beat in his performance, Louis caught the eye of his manager, Joe Glazer, who was standing in the wings. Joe had been with Louis for years, had navigated the treacherous waters of the entertainment business, knew how to read his artist's signals. Louis nodded toward the disturbance, then did something he'd never done before. He stopped mid-song. The crowd fell silent, 2,000 people holding their breath, waiting to see what Satchmo would do next. "Folks," Louis said, his voice carrying across the field with that familiar warmth that had charmed the world. "Seems like we got some excitement in the audience tonight. But you know what? Music is like medicine. It's got the power to heal, to bring folks together, to calm troubled waters." Sheriff Thorne had spotted Marcus and was pushing through the crowd toward him. The boy looked around desperately, trapped between the rope that marked the segregated seating and the men who wanted to destroy him. Louis made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, not because he regretted it, but because of what it revealed about the world he lived in. I want to invite a young trumpet player up here to join me, Louis announced. Where's that boy with the horn? Come on up here, son. Let's show these good people what music can do. The crowd murmured in confusion. This wasn't part of the show. Sheriff Thorne stopped moving, uncertain. Was this planned? Was this some kind of setup? Marcus looked up at the stage, at Louis Armstrong, his hero, his inspiration, the man whose records he'd played until the grooves wore smooth. Louis was looking directly at him, nodding encouragingly, but walking through that crowd, crossing that rope, stepping onto that stage meant exposing himself completely. It meant trusting his life to a man he'd never met. But what choice did he have? The alternative was certain death. Marcus pushed forward, his legs shaking, his trumpet case clutched against his chest. The crowd parted reluctantly. Someone shouted, "That's him! That's the boy!" Sheriff Thorne's hand moved to his gun, but he couldn't draw it now. Not with 2,000 witnesses watching, not with Louis Armstrong himself orchestrating whatever this was. Marcus climbed the wooden steps to the stage. Up close, Louis could see the exhaustion in the boy's face, the dried blood on his knuckles from running through brambles, the terror in his eyes that he was trying so hard to hide. "What's your name, son?" Louis asked, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Marcus," the boy whispered. "Marcus, that's a strong name. You play trumpet, Marcus?" The boy nodded, unable to speak. "Well then, let's make some music together. Nothing heals like music, folks. Nothing brings people together like music." For the next 20 minutes, Louis Armstrong and Marcus Johnson played together on that stage in the Mississippi heat. Marcus was talented, gifted even, his young voice blending with Louis' in harmonies that seemed to transcend the ugliness of the world around them. The crowd, both black and white, listened in rapt attention. Even Sheriff Thorne seemed momentarily confused by the beauty of what he was hearing. But Louis knew this was just buying time. When the music stopped, the hatred would return. When the crowd dispersed, Marcus would still be a hunted boy in a hostile land. As the set ended, Louis whispered to Marcus, "Stay close to me, boy. We're going to get you out of here." The plan Louis hatched in those desperate minutes was insane, brilliant, and completely illegal. As the crowd applauded and began to disperse, Louis announced that he was feeling poorly, that the heat had gotten to him, and that he needed to rest before traveling to his next engagement in Memphis. He would be staying at the Riverside Hotel, he said, the only place in Clarksdale that accommodated black performers. What he didn't announce was that Marcus Johnson would be traveling with them. Joe Glazer understood immediately. He'd been in this business long enough to recognize a setup when he saw one, and he knew his employer's conscience better than anyone. While Louis continued to sign autographs and shake hands, playing the role of the gracious entertainer, Joe quietly arranged for a second car, a backup route, and most importantly, he made a phone call to a contact in Memphis who owed the organization a favor. Sheriff Thorne approached the stage as Louis was packing up his trumpet. "That was quite a show, Armstrong," he said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Especially that boy you had up there. You know anything about him?" Louis looked Thorne in the eye with that easy smile that had disarmed critics from New York to New Orleans. "Sheriff, I know music when I hear it. That boy's got talent. Reminds me of myself when I was coming up in New Orleans, you know? Music doesn't see color, Sheriff. It just sees soul." "Well, that particular soul has caused some trouble around here," Thorne said. "I might need to have a conversation with him." "Sheriff," Louis said, his voice still friendly but with an edge that hadn't been there before, "that boy is under my protection now. He's part of my show, and my show is moving on to Memphis tomorrow morning. I hope that won't be a problem." It was a calculated risk. Louis Armstrong was famous enough that harming him would bring unwanted attention from the outside world. But this was Mississippi in 1952, where black men had disappeared for less. Thorne studied Louis for a long moment. "Your protection, huh? That's interesting, Armstrong, because the way I hear it, that boy committed a crime in my county, and in my county, I'm the law." "Sheriff," Louis said, never breaking eye contact, "I've played for presidents and kings. I've brought joy to millions of people around the world, and I've learned that the only crime here is the one that keeps people from sharing their gifts with the world. That boy has a gift, and I'm going to make sure the world gets to hear it." The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Finally, Thorne spat into the dirt and walked away. "Watch yourself, Armstrong," he called back. "This is Mississippi. Even famous trumpeters can have accidents here." That night, at the Riverside Hotel, Louis Armstrong barely slept. Marcus was in the room next door, finally able to eat a hot meal and clean the blood from his hands. But Louis knew the danger was far from over. Thorne would be back with more men, probably before dawn. They needed to move fast. At 3 a.m., 2 cars left the Riverside Hotel by different routes. One carried Louis's usual equipment and band members, traveling openly on the main highway to Memphis. The other, an unmarked sedan, took back roads through the Mississippi Delta, carrying Louis, Marcus, and Joe Glazer. The drive should have taken 4 hours. It took 8, with multiple stops to avoid roadblocks, detours through cotton fields, and a terrifying hour spent hiding in a barn while Sheriff Thorne's men searched the area with dogs. But the most dangerous moment came at sunrise, when they reached a remote crossroads and found Thorne waiting for them. The sheriff stood in the middle of the dirt road, blocking their path, his hand on his gun. Behind him, 3 other men with rifles. This wasn't law enforcement anymore. This was a lynching party. "End of the road, Armstrong," Thorne shouted. "Hand over the boy and you can go on your way. Don't, and we'll handle all of you." Louis stepped out of the car slowly, his hands visible. Marcus started to follow, but Louis motioned him back. "Sheriff," Louis called, his voice carrying across the morning air. "You know who I am. You know people will ask questions if something happens to me. Important people. People with influence." Thorne laughed. "I'll tell them you had an accident. Car trouble in the Mississippi heat. Happens all the time." "Maybe," Louis said, walking closer. "But Sheriff, before you do something you can't take back, I want you to think about something." He was close enough now that Thorne could see his face clearly, could see the man behind the famous smile. "I grew up in New Orleans," Louis continued, his voice quiet but carrying. "In a place where people like you told people like me where we could walk, where we could eat, where we could live. And you know what I learned? I learned that music is more powerful than hatred. I learned that one beautiful note can do more good in the world than 1,000 ugly words." Thorne's grip tightened on his gun. "Save the speeches, boy. This is about respect, about knowing your place." "My place?" Louis asked, and for the first time, his mask slipped. The easy smile vanished, replaced by something harder, older, forged in the furnaces of discrimination and injustice. "Sheriff, my place is wherever I choose to stand, and right now, I choose to stand between you and that child." "You'd die for him?" Louis thought about that boy in the car behind him, about the trumpet in his case, about the music he might make if he lived to grow old. He thought about his own journey from the streets of New Orleans to stages around the world, and all the people who had helped him along the way. "Sheriff," Louis said finally, "I've spent my life making people happy, making them forget for a few minutes how cruel this world can be. But if I let you hurt that boy, if I walk away now, then every note I ever played, every smile I ever brought to someone's face, it would all be meaningless. So yes, I'd die for him, because that's what it means to be human." The standoff lasted forever and an instant. Thorne's men shifted nervously. This wasn't what they'd signed up for. Killing Louis Armstrong would bring heat from Washington, from the press, from the entertainment industry. The story would be too big to cover up. Finally, Thorne lowered his gun. "Go on then," he said. "Get out of my county. But don't ever come back, Armstrong. And if that boy ever sets foot in Mississippi again, I'll kill him myself." Louis nodded. "I understand, Sheriff, and I hope you understand something too. That boy is going to be somebody. He's going to make music that will outlive all of us. And every time someone hears him play, they're going to remember that there were people who tried to stop him and people who helped him fly." 3 hours later, Marcus Johnson was in Memphis, safe in a hotel room, crying as he called his grandmother to tell her he was alive. Within a week, Louis had arranged for Marcus to audition for a music scholarship at a college in Chicago. Within a year, Marcus was playing trumpet professionally with a touring band. But the story doesn't end there. In 1957, when President Eisenhower sent federal troops to Little Rock to protect 9 black children integrating Central High School, Louis Armstrong publicly praised the decision in interviews, calling Eisenhower a good man for finally standing up for what was right. What the reporters didn't know was that sitting in the front row of his concert that night was a young trumpet player named Marcus Johnson, now a successful musician in his own right. In 1963, when Louis performed at the Newport Jazz Festival, he dedicated a song to all the young musicians finding their voice in a changing world. Marcus was backstage that night, and when their eyes met across the crowd, both men smiled. And in 1968, when Louis Armstrong recorded "What a Wonderful World," he was thinking about a hot August night in Mississippi, and a boy with a trumpet who had taught him what courage really meant. Marcus Johnson went on to become one of the premier jazz educators in the Midwest, teaching hundreds of students over a 40-year career. He never spoke publicly about that night in Mississippi, but every student he taught heard the same lesson Louis Armstrong had taught him, that music is more powerful than hatred, that one beautiful note can overcome 1,000 ugly words. When Louis Armstrong died in 1971, Marcus Johnson was among the mourners at his funeral. But he didn't just mourn the loss of a musical legend, he mourned the loss of the man who had shown him that true greatness isn't measured by fame or talent, but by the willingness to risk everything you have to protect someone who has nothing. Sheriff Clayton Thorne died in 1978, never knowing that the boy he'd tried to kill became one of America's most respected music teachers, never knowing that his hatred had been defeated not by violence, but by an act of kindness that rippled through generations. The crossroads where Louis Armstrong faced down those guns is now a soybean field. There's no marker, no memorial, nothing to commemorate what happened there. But sometimes, if you listen closely on a quiet Mississippi morning, you might hear the ghost of a trumpet playing in the distance. And if you follow that sound, you'll find the truth that Louis Armstrong knew all along, that music can overcome anything, even hatred, if somebody has the courage to play it loud enough for the world to hear. The boy who ran for his life became a man who taught others to fly. And the man who risked everything to save him proved that sometimes the most powerful song you can play isn't written in notes and measures. Sometimes it's written in choices, in the moment when you decide to stand up for what's right even when the whole world is telling you to sit down. That's the real story of Louis Armstrong. Not just the man who made the world smile, but the man who showed us all what it means to be truly wonderful.